I've had the idea for today's diorama for quite a while. The problem was I needed 2 of these, and they were hard to find for some reason. But as you can see, that's not a problem anymore. How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boylai Hobby Time. When I started this channel on the second day of 2020, I didn't know what direction I was going to take it. But on April 30th of that same year, I made my very first diorama, and that was K2SO's Last Stand. I enjoyed that project very much, and now, more than 5 years later, dioramas are mostly what I'm known for. That being said, ever since that first Rogue One inspired diorama at the very beginning, I've had the idea to recreate a similar moment that happens just before that one, with K2 hacking another droid of this same type, so that he can get the layout for the Scarif base and find the vault. What stood out to me during that scene is that the eyes of both droids are in a synchronized flicker. I thought it would be cool to recreate that effect, but back then I had absolutely no idea how to do that. I had pretty much done no wiring or electronics of any kind before starting this channel. But I realize now that there's a couple ways to do that, and I found a very convenient and easy one that I'm going to use today. To prevent having to come back and disassemble these robots down the road, I worked on creating a path for the wiring from the get-go. I actually really enjoy assembling 2 of the same model kit at one time. Seems very efficient. You just use one set of instructions and then just assemble everything as you go, starting with the heads, as you can see here. I moved on to both torsos at the same time, then on to the legs, and so on. I was re-inspired to make this diorama after finishing Season 2 of Andor. I personally really enjoyed the show. I was watching it hoping for some good moments to recreate as dioramas, and there probably were a few, but overall, what I really liked about the show is that epic moments weren't really the focus, nor were they relied upon to sell the story. The point was actually the compounding impact of small, seemingly unimportant people and events that were the foundation of and led to the formation of the rebellion, culminating ultimately in the destruction of the Death Star. And as someone who really enjoys studying history, Andor reminded me in many ways of the real events that led up to the Great War. Sure, there's one single notable moment that we're all taught in school that triggered the whole thing, but the ideological and economic changes in the world were the springs that were being wound tightly under the surface for decades. And I feel like Andor did a great job of winding the springs, if you will, of the Star Wars universe. But you're not here to hear my opinions on Andor. You're here to watch me make a diorama, so I will get back to that. As you can see, I was successful in pulling the wires all the way through from the eyes to the foot on this one, and on the other droid it goes out of his knee because he is being hacked in the back of the head, which doesn't sound comfortable. The next step was to add a scomp link onto K2SO's left arm. And yes, scomp link is a funny name, but that's the same thing that R2-D2 uses to hack into panels and open doors. And a few other droids also have them, like the KX droids that you see here. It's kind of like a USB cable, but it's round, so you can't accidentally try and plug it in backwards. But if you twist it the right way, you can hack into the mainframe of anything. Anyway, I made mine from a pogo pin that was gifted to me by a patron. At some point while building this, I lost the piece of the arm that I had removed, and I remember reading online that it's probably within 3 feet of where I last saw it, so I crawled around on the floor for a very long time, and my wife found it in another room. I guess the takeaway from that is don't believe everything that you read on the internet. That being said, it all worked out, and I'm very happy with how it looks. With both kits customized, it was time to move on to the base. I had an unused base from the Perfect Grade Millennium Falcon that I built last year, and I wanted to repurpose it for this project. I really liked the angles and the size. I was able to easily cut it into 2 pieces using my bandsaw. I made sure that the figures would both fit on the base, which they did, and after that it was time to start making this base look like something that came from Star Wars. For starters, I needed a new surface for these to stand on that was nice and smooth, and for that I'll be using some 040 styrene. I scored and snapped the styrene, and one of those pieces happened to be exactly the right size, and I used some plastic cement to weld the two surfaces together, essentially creating a brand new single piece of plastic. Next, I needed to do some repairs and cleanup on the backdrop. I thought about recreating the back wall with the red panels and all of the buttons on it, but I decided to go with one of the side walls instead so I could use this patterned metal sheet that I had from previous projects. They used to sell this stuff at a couple of the big box hobby stores, but they don't anymore, and I don't know what happened to it. So that's a shame. I used it for this project though because I wanted the middle of the backdrop to be backlit and have that classic imperial wall look to it. I made a little trim piece to go in the front to clean up the imperfections on the metal sheet, and then I glued it all in place. And there was a little bit of super glue that made its way out the sides, which I cleaned up with some super glue remover, and after that it was time to work on the sides. I used a photo reference, and then I cut each of these pieces out twice. I dry fit those to ensure that they looked right, and then I glued them all together using some more plastic cement. Every time I make something Star Wars related in 1:12 scale, using styrene, it always feels very nostalgic to me. The last thing to do with the back wall was to patch up the sides with a little bit more styrene, and technically the wall should have been a bit taller to be 1:12 scale. But like I said, I'm working with what I have, so it ended up being a little bit stylized, and that's okay. Before moving on to the painting step, I made sure to get a hole drilled for my switch, and then I scored some panel lines on the floor. This display is going to be powered by 2 AA batteries, so I made sure to get the housing mounted to the bottom of the base, and then it was ready for some paint. But just like the Rebellion in Andor, first, it was time to organize. I got the base and the back wall primed black, and while the figures and the wall can stay flat, the floor needed a coat of gloss varnish. And while we wait for that to dry, I will be adding the rest of the color and also giving a huge shout out to all of my patrons. For the back wall, I used a flat gray, which is just a combination of black and white primer from Vallejo, and then I color matched the nearly black gray of K2SO to cover the newly constructed Scomplink. And once again, I think Scomplink is kind of a funny name, but if you're a huge Scomplink fan, please don't be offended by that. Instead of painting on the details, I decided since I have all these nice decals, I might as well use them. I sliced out the Imperial shoulder symbol, I soaked it in water, applied my microsol, and I waited. And waited. And it just would not transfer. That's because it was a sticker. After discovering my mistake, I broke out the decals and I used a combination of them and the stickers to give these droids their color. And once that was done, I waited a couple hours for the glossy surface to be mostly dry, and it was ready to be assembled. For the back wall, I played around with multiple layers of plastics of different opacities, trying to get the right amount of diffusion. And it was really hard to do because of how close my light source was to the diffusers. It didn't end up being perfect, but I'm happy with what I got. And it actually has kind of a nice stylized glow. It was at this point that I could glue that back wall in place and then get my wires all connected. I ran them to the switch and then to the LED, which I then glued behind the diffusers. With the back wall done, it was time to move on to the eyes. And to get those droid eyes to flicker, I used this Caru Castle cloner from Terraintronics. Throw a flickering LED in there, then you connect your power source and your LEDs that you want to mimic the flicker, and it does all the work. I'll throw a link to Terraintronics in the description. It was now time to glue the droids in place, and to get them to hold their positions, I flooded their joints with more plastic cement, which is also known as the Plastic Tin Man's Tears, or plastic tetanus. I only say that because tetanus has been on my mind, but that's a story for next time. The last thing to do was get everything wired up to some resistors so that those little LEDs did not blow up. Once that was all wired, I called it good. that is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.